In the unforgiving landscape of war, every soldier is expected to follow orders, to fight for their country, and to protect the innocent. But sometimes, those boundaries break. What happens when the very soldiers tasked with defending a nation cross a line that no one should ever cross? What happens when the protectors become the predators? This is the true account of the Kill Team, a group of U.S. Army soldiers who, in 2010, carried out a series of cold-blooded murders of Afghan civilians. Not only did these men break the rules of war, they reveled in them. They took the lives of innocent people and then staged the deaths, making it appear as if these murders were part of a combat engagement. Their actions didn't remain hidden forever. The darkness they created was soon uncovered, leading to the public exposure of the crimes, the legal proceedings that followed, and the moral collapse of a unit that was once meant to serve and protect. Tonight, we'll examine this devastating chapter, how it unfolded, how it was uncovered, and the chilling aftermath of what can only be described as war crimes. The year was 2010, and the United States was deeply involved in the Afghanistan conflict. A country already scarred by war was now a battleground for soldiers caught in the constant tension of military engagement, fear, and survival. Among the many units stationed in Afghanistan, there was one in particular, the 5th Stryker Brigade Combat Team, that would be marked by a series of events that would expose a horrifying reality. During the 5th Stryker Brigade's deployment, the threat wasn't limited to enemy combatants, it extended to civilians as well. Afghan civilians, men, women, and children who had no part in the war, yet found themselves caught in the crossfire. Among the most shocking and tragic of these incidents was the murder of a 15-year-old boy named Gul Mudin, whose life was taken by soldiers who viewed him not as a child, but as prey in their warped version of combat. This Kill Team did not see the moral lines that separated soldiers from murderers. Instead, they fabricated stories and staged their murders to resemble combat encounters. They even took photographs with the bodies of their victims, trophies of war, as if the lives they stole were just another mark of victory. What followed was a web of lies, cover-ups, and betrayal within the ranks. It wasn't until one of their own spoke out that the truth came to light. The Kill Team murders were exposed for the world to see, leading to investigations, court-martials, and the eventual convictions of the soldiers involved. War changes people, it exposes the darkest aspects of humanity. What unfolds as those assigned to uphold order lose their moral compass? The soldiers of the Kill Team crossed a line that most of us can't even comprehend. As we move forward, we will explore how these men became what they never thought they could be, murderers who took joy in their actions and were willing to do anything to cover their tracks. The murders didn't stop with Gul Mudin. There were others, families torn apart, children lost, and lives extinguished with no remorse. The scale of the atrocities wasn't just about the lives taken, it was about how these soldiers convinced themselves they were justified. And what makes it even worse is that the murderers, many of whom had been trained to protect and defend, saw themselves as untouchable. The military system had failed to check their actions in real time. As we progress, we step away from the battlefield and enter the courtroom. What transpires when the hidden truths of these actions come to light? How do the soldiers involved handle their exposure, and how does the military address the repercussions of crimes that have affected both sides? In 2010, Afghanistan was a battlefield like no other. The war had been raging for nearly a decade, and the U.S. military was deep in a fight for control in a country that had long been a thorn in the side of empires. For soldiers deployed to Afghanistan, the harsh terrain, the constant threat of ambushes, and the ever-present danger of insurgents were just part of the daily struggle. But amid all the chaos, there was something else, something that quietly ate away at the souls of the men sent to fight. The psychological toll of war is rarely discussed, but in the case of the 5th Stryker Brigade, the strain would lead to actions that defy all comprehension. The 5th Stryker Brigade was deployed to the Panjwai district in southern Afghanistan. The district was infamous for its harsh geography, with jagged mountains and narrow paths that were ideal for ambushes. The danger in the district wasn't solely due to the terrain, it was also the insurgents, who concealed themselves within the civilian population, making them nearly impossible to detect. The soldiers had to be constantly on guard, never knowing who was a friend and who was an enemy. For the soldiers of the 5th Stryker Brigade, the threat wasn't just physical. It was psychological. The constant fear of death, the pressure to perform, and the ambiguity of their mission began to weigh heavily on them. The fear of making the wrong choice, of killing civilians who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, began to cloud their minds. The pressure to perform, the constant state of alertness, and the long months of fighting were beginning to erode the soldiers' mental state. The brutal conditions, coupled with a lack of proper rest and support, began to blur the line between right and wrong. In this environment, the soldiers were pushed to their breaking point. With time, the environment became a force to reckon with. The oppressive heat of the desert, the lack of clean water, and the suffocating dust in the air, all of this made the soldiers' mental health a ticking time bomb. Yet, perhaps the most dangerous threat of all was the ever-looming presence of the Taliban. This was a fight where every corner, every shadow, hid the possibility of death. Prolonged deployments like this one begin to erode the very core of a soldier's identity. The psychological toll of witnessing death and destruction day after day can lead to emotional numbness, a loss of empathy, and in some cases, the loss of one's moral compass. The horrors they witnessed, the fear they lived with, and the constant threat of violence began to twist the soldier's sense of right and wrong. And for some, that line was already becoming blurred. Those who once swore to protect civilians were now looking at the very people they were supposed to protect as enemies. The strain of battle, the loss of comrades, and the constant feeling of being hunted started to make some soldiers see the Afghans not as human beings, but as targets. It began with something small, almost unnoticed, an act that could be brushed off, swept under the rug. But from this moment, things began to change. The kill team wasn't a formal unit at first. It started with a group of soldiers within the 5th Stryker Brigade, each one feeding off the frustration, fear, and pressure of the brutal conditions they faced. They saw themselves as hunters in a war zone, and the line between enemy combatants and innocent civilians became increasingly blurred. The first few acts of violence were justified in their minds, self-serving actions dismissed as collateral damage. No one questioned the killings, no one except those who weren't willing to turn a blind eye to what was happening. As the days passed, the soldiers grew bolder. The very men who were supposed to protect the people they fought for began to view them as obstacles in their way, targets in a game they felt they couldn't lose. The weak civilians, those they didn't deem worth protecting, these were their victims. They saw themselves as warriors in a world where only the strongest survived. The more they killed, the more detached they became. What they failed to see, however, was that they were becoming something worse than their enemies. They were becoming monsters. Then, on March 15, 2010, a 15-year-old Afghan boy named Gul Mudin would become the first victim of their cruelty. His death, as cold and calculated as the others that would follow, marked the beginning of an unspeakable tragedy. He was no soldier, no threat to the men who took his life. He was just a child, walking through the wrong place at the wrong time. The soldiers saw him, and that was all it took. They targeted him, executed him without hesitation, and then staged the scene. They planted a weapon next to his lifeless body, hoping to pass it off as a combat encounter. To them, it didn't matter that this boy had done nothing wrong. To them, he was just another casualty in a war that had already claimed too many lives. But this wasn't just a random killing. The soldiers weren't satisfied with simply ending his life, they had to cover their tracks. They staged the death to make it appear as though Gul Mudin had been an enemy combatant, a threat. They planted a weapon near his body, posing him as if he were a soldier killed in the line of fire. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated. It was cold. And it was deliberate. And even more chilling, they took photographs, images of themselves grinning beside the corpse of a dead boy, posing as though they had just achieved a victory. The photographs taken that day would become one of the most damning pieces of evidence when the truth eventually came to light. These images, which the soldiers had taken as trophies of war, were later discovered. They showed not just the bodies of their victims, but the chilling smiles of the men who took their lives. It was these images, these souvenirs of murder, that would later unravel their lies and bring their actions into the harsh light of public scrutiny. But in that moment, the soldiers didn't think about the consequences. They were living in a world where killing had become a game, a twisted version of survival. They didn't think about the lives they had taken, the families they had destroyed. They only cared about the next kill. What the kill team didn't realize was that their actions were not as easily covered up as they thought. Word began to spread, whispers in the ranks, doubts creeping into the minds of those who had witnessed the murders but stayed silent. The truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it is buried. And the soldiers of the kill team would eventually face the consequences of their monstrous decisions. What began as one murder, swiftly concealed and buried in the rubble of war, soon transformed into something far worse. With the first crime covered up, the soldiers believed they had found a loophole, a way to commit atrocities with impunity. The fear of getting caught had vanished, replaced by a dangerous sense of entitlement, as though they were above the law. The first murder was not the end, it was merely the beginning. The soldiers didn't just stop there. They grew bolder, with each new act more calculated than the last. A pattern emerged. What began as one spontaneous act of violence, soon became a systematic operation. The deaths were no longer a matter of random chance, they were methodical executions, carefully staged to look like combat engagements. Weapons were planted beside the bodies of the slain, each one carefully arranged to create a narrative of justified violence. What was once a fleeting act of cruelty had evolved into an organized operation. It wasn't just murder now, it was a twisted ritual of war. And in their minds, each kill was not only sanctioned, it was a trophy, a grotesque proof of their power. As the weeks passed, these men grew increasingly untouchable in their own eyes. The absence of oversight allowed them to continue without fear of reprisal. They didn't need to worry about accountability, there were no consequences for their actions, no consequences for taking life with no justification other than their own sadistic desires. But the murders were not only about power. They were about pride. These soldiers, in their twisted minds, had become hunters, gathering trophies of war in the form of photographs. Each picture taken with a victim's lifeless body became a trophy of conquest, a reminder of their superiority. They posed with the bodies of the dead, smiling, joking as though they had just completed a mission of valor. And these photographs weren't just mementos of a time when they crossed the line, they were evidence. They were proof of what they had done, what they had become. But in their eyes, these images weren't damning, they were celebratory. As the killings continued, something shifted. What was once a routine act of violence became an obsession. The soldiers' humanity, already strained by the pressures of war, was now completely eroded. It wasn't about survival anymore, it was about domination. The terror they had once felt in the face of the enemy was now replaced by something even more chilling, fear of the truth, and a hunger to prove they were still in control. And so, they continued. With each murder, with each staged scene, they fell deeper into a hole they couldn't escape. And in the shadows, the truth waited, ready to emerge, to expose the evil they had done. The truth, however, has a way of clawing its way to the surface. What was initially concealed in the shadows began to unravel. The military, despite their initial efforts to bury the truth, could no longer ignore the weight of the whispers among the soldiers. An investigation was launched, though many believed it would be nothing more than a formality. But the truth does not stay hidden forever. The first cracks in the wall came when photographs, the very evidence that should never have existed, surfaced. These images, taken with smug grins and twisted pride, revealed the gruesome reality of the killings. The soldiers had believed they were untouchable, that their actions would be dismissed as the chaos of war. But these photographs told a different story. The military's investigation was thorough but far from easy. The soldiers involved, trained to cover their tracks, had no intention of making the truth easy to uncover. As the investigation progressed, each statement, each interview, revealed more layers of deception. It wasn't just about the murders, it was about the culture that allowed such things to happen without consequence. Witnesses began to come forward, reluctant at first, but knowing that the truth needed to be told. Some soldiers broke their silence, recounting the murders and the casual way in which the kill team operated. But not all were so forthcoming. Many still defended their actions, clinging to the belief that they had done nothing wrong. The divide grew between those who admitted their guilt and those who remained loyal to the team's deadly mission. Behind the investigation, however, was a struggle for control. Higher authorities, desperate to move past the scandal, pushed for a quick resolution. But the truth could not be so easily swept under the rug. Pressure mounted on investigators as they sought to expose the full extent of the crimes while others worked tirelessly to close the case quickly. The demand for transparency clashed with the military's desire to protect its own image, leading to tension between the higher-ups and the men who were determined to uncover the whole truth. It wasn't just about the soldiers involved, it was about what the military was willing to reveal about its failings, about how much they were willing to expose to the world. It was the photographs, chilling in their simplicity, that would become the turning point in the investigation. These images, captured by the soldiers themselves, were the undeniable proof that the murders were not just acts of war. They were acts of murder. With each image, the wall of lies grew thinner. And when the photographs were presented in court, they sealed the fate of the kill team. The power of these photographs was not just in their depiction of the bodies, but in what they revealed about the mentality of the soldiers. The grins, the pride, the detachment from the human lives they had extinguished, these were the true faces of the soldiers who had once sworn an oath to protect. These images, these moments frozen in time, told a story of darkness that words could never express. As the investigation unfolded, the reactions of the soldiers involved were as varied as the crimes themselves. Some continued to deny their actions, stubbornly holding on to the belief that they were justified. But others, their consciences finally catching up to them, spoke out, revealing the chilling truth. These men weren't all cut from the same cloth. Some were consumed by guilt, while others remained unwavering in their defense of their actions. The guilt of some soldiers was evident. They were haunted by the faces of the victims, tormented by the screams of the innocent lives they had taken. But for others, the reality of their crimes never fully sank in. They had become so disconnected from humanity, so lost in the violence they had perpetrated, that they couldn't fathom the depth of their wrongdoings. The legal proceedings that followed the killings were more than just a formality. They were a moment of reckoning, a chance to hold those responsible accountable for their actions. The kill team was about to face the full force of military justice, but could the court ever truly restore what was broken? As the trial began, it was clear that the emotional and psychological toll on the soldiers who participated in these murders was immeasurable. For some, facing the consequences of their actions was like confronting a nightmare they had long buried. The photographs, the lies, they had haunted them for months, but now they were out in the open. The guilt was impossible to escape. For others, however, the trial was another opportunity to deflect, to continue to justify their actions in their own minds. Some believed they had done nothing wrong, that the war justified the means, that they were soldiers, doing what was necessary to survive. And yet, in the cold walls of that courtroom, they had to confront the reality of what they had done. As the trial progressed, the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The photographs, the testimonies, the confession of those who had broken their silence, all pointed to a brutal truth that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just murder, it was a pattern of deliberate, calculated actions, carried out in the name of war, but without the righteousness that war demands. The court's decision was not an easy one, but it was inevitable. The soldiers involved in the kill team were convicted of war crimes. Some were handed life sentences, others faced long prison terms. But even as these sentences were read, it became clear that no prison could truly hold the guilt these men would carry for the rest of their lives. But as the verdicts were handed down, a larger question began to unfold, one that would echo long after the courtroom doors closed. What does military justice mean when it fails to prevent such atrocities in the first place? What responsibility do those in charge have when the chain of command turns a blind eye to the moral decay within their ranks? Military culture often revolves around loyalty and obedience, but what happens when that loyalty is misplaced? What happens when soldiers stop seeing the distinction between right and wrong and begin to see war as a game of survival, where everything becomes a casualty? The trial, while necessary, was only the beginning of the fallout. As the news spread, the public reacted with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. The idea that men sworn to protect and defend could commit such heinous acts was a blow to the very fabric of the military. And it wasn't just the civilians who were shaken, this was a wound that ran deep within the military itself. Media outlets, the public, and even veterans themselves wrestled with the moral implications of what had happened. Was this an isolated incident, or was it a sign of something much deeper, a breakdown in the moral compass of soldiers at war? The fallout from the trial reached far beyond the courtroom. The kill team murders had exposed a dark undercurrent within the military, and the implications of this revelation would not be easily swept away. The military, often held in high regard, now found its reputation tarnished by the actions of a few. The world had seen a glimpse of the moral cost of war, and for many, the image of the military would never be the same. For those who served honorably, the shadows cast by these murders were a painful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. For the kill team, their convictions were a small step toward justice, but they would never be free from the weight of their actions. The men who participated in the kill team murders, the aftermath wasn't just about serving time in prison. Their crimes became a permanent mark on their souls. The psychological toll was unbearable. The images of the innocent civilians they killed haunted them in their sleep, in the quiet of the night, when they were alone with their thoughts. Some soldiers could barely look at themselves in the mirror, struggling to reconcile the men they were before with the monsters they had become. The scars of war had taken a different form. It wasn't just physical injury, they had broken their own moral compass, and no amount of time or punishment could undo that. Others spiraled into mental health crises, unable to deal with the weight of their actions. Many suffered from PTSD, not just from combat, but from their own choices, the people they had killed, the lives they had destroyed. The long-lasting effects of their actions became the real punishment. In the wake of the murders, the U.S. military had no choice but to confront the uncomfortable truth about its system. The leadership failures, the lack of accountability, these were not just issues within the kill team, but they were symptoms of a larger problem within the armed forces. The military was forced to reevaluate its policies, to reflect on the type of training soldiers were receiving and the environments they were being exposed to. The high-stress nature of modern warfare had created a toxic atmosphere, one where the lines between right and wrong became blurred. But the reforms weren't just about changing policies. They were about instilling a culture of accountability, of ensuring that soldiers were not just prepared to fight, but prepared to do so with honor. The military had to ensure that its personnel would be held to the highest standards, even in the most difficult and harrowing situations. And then there are the victims. For the families of those who were murdered, those who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, the aftermath was even more devastating. Their lives were torn apart, and the wounds left behind never truly healed. For many, justice came too late, and for others, it never came at all. The families of those killed by the kill team were left to mourn the loss of loved ones who had been taken from them violently, without cause. The knowledge that their family members were killed by soldiers, supposed to protect them, haunted them in ways words can hardly describe. Though the court-martials and convictions brought some sense of justice, for many families, there was no closure. The violence, the cruelty, it was a permanent scar, one that time could never fully erase. The murders committed by the kill team didn't just tarnish the reputation of those directly involved, they stained the very fabric of military operations in Afghanistan. The scrutiny on U.S. operations intensified. The questions surrounding the treatment of civilians, the methods of warfare, and the integrity of soldiers in combat became impossible to ignore. The U.S. military found itself under an unprecedented level of scrutiny. International human rights organizations, lawmakers, and the media demanded answers. What had gone wrong? How could this happen? How could soldiers sworn to uphold justice become perpetrators of unimaginable evil? The U.S. military had to take a long, hard look at itself and the culture it had fostered. The ramifications of this incident went far beyond the convicted soldiers. It forced military leadership to confront the moral and ethical questions that had been avoided for too long. This is not just a history lesson. It is a call to action. We must never forget the lessons learned from these tragedies, and we must always ensure that we are vigilant against the darker sides of human nature. It is our responsibility to ensure that the atrocities of the past are not repeated. We must look at our actions and ask, what will we do to make sure history doesn't repeat itself? The cost of silence is far too high. It's our duty to share these stories, to ensure that the sacrifices of those who came before us were not in vain. It's up to us to push for accountability, to stand for what is right, and to help those who have suffered rebuild their lives. If you found this video enlightening, share it, subscribe for more educational content, and join us in the ongoing conversation about military ethics, war crimes, and the need for accountability.